At what point does a spouse's loyalty to their parent become a betrayal of their partner? I was 12 weeks pregnant when I felt something warm running down my leg during my afternoon shift at work. Excused myself quietly and walked to the bathroom with my heart already doing something strange in my chest. When I looked down and saw the blood soaking through my dress, I felt the floor tilt beneath me. I grabbed the edge of the sink and stood there for a moment, just breathing, before I reached for my phone with shaking hands. Mac picked up on the second ring. "Something is wrong with the baby," I said. "There is so much blood. Come get me now." I heard him inhale sharply. Then I heard movement, keys being grabbed, feet hitting the floor fast. "I'm on my way," he said. "Don't move." By the time they got me into a room and hooked up to the monitors, our baby was already gone. The doctor used words like spontaneous and nothing you could have done, and I nodded along because I needed something to do with my face while he talked, but none of the words reached me the way they were supposed to. All I could hear underneath all of them was that the tiny heartbeat we had watched flicker on an ultrasound screen 3 weeks earlier had stopped completely, and there was no medical explanation for why Mac sat on the edge of my hospital bed and put his face in his hands and cried in a way I had never seen him cry before. I reached over and touched his shoulder and said I was sorry. He looked up immediately and said, "Don't, this isn't your fault," and pulled me into his chest and held me there until the nurse came in to explain what happened next. We agreed to tell no one until we were ready. I told Mac I couldn't handle his mother right now, and he nodded and said we would tell people when I was ready, and that no one needed to know yet. I trusted him completely because I had no reason not to. What I forgot was that keeping secrets from Lena was essentially impossible because she had a key to our house and used it whenever the mood struck. 3 days after leaving the hospital, I was sitting on the kitchen floor. I hadn't made it past the kitchen that morning. I had opened a drawer looking for something, I couldn't even remember what, and found the small onesie I had bought the week before we lost the baby. It was white with yellow ducks on it, and I had bought it impulsively at a drugstore because it made me smile, and I had thought we had all the time in the world to fill a drawer with things like that. I was sitting on the floor holding it and crying into it when I heard the front door open. Lena appeared in the kitchen doorway with grocery bags in both hands and her lips pressed into that thin line of disapproval she reserved for situations she found beneath her standards. She looked at the tissues scattered across the floor and the empty ice cream container on the counter and the general wreckage of 3 days of private grief and said, "Well, this is quite a scene." I wiped my face with the back of my hand and said I wasn't expecting her. She stepped over me to set her bags on the counter, literally stepped over me, where I was sitting on the floor, and said that when Mac had told her I wasn't feeling well, she had assumed it was something minor. A cold maybe? Not a complete breakdown in the middle of the day. She turned and noticed the onesie in my hands and her eyes narrowed. She asked why I was sitting on the floor crying over baby clothes. I didn't want to tell her anything. I genuinely did not want to say a single word about any of it to this woman, but I was exhausted in a way that went past tired into something hollow and empty, and I just wanted her to leave, so I said it as plainly and quickly as I could. I lost the baby 3 days ago. We weren't going to tell anyone yet. Lena's face rearranged itself into something that almost resembled sympathy, if you didn't know her well enough to see the calculation running underneath it. She lowered herself gracefully to the floor beside me and took my hands in hers and said, "Oh, honey, that explains everything." She said she had known something was off with me lately, but had assumed I was just being moody again. I said I was not being moody. "I lost my baby." She squeezed my hands and nodded slowly. She said she was sure I was blaming myself, even though the doctor had probably told me these things just happened sometimes, especially with first pregnancies, especially when the mother was under a significant amount of stress. She tilted her head and looked at me with her eyes soft and her voice gentle and said I had been under a lot of stress lately. Hadn't I? Working all those hours, not taking proper care of myself. She said she had told Mac months ago that I needed to slow down, but I had never listened. I pulled my hands away and told her the doctor had said it wasn't anything I did. She nodded slowly again. "Of course he did," she said. "They always say that. But we both know I could have taken better care of myself, eaten better, rested more. I wasn't exactly known for putting my family first, was I?" She patted my knee and said, "But what was done, and there was no point dwelling on it now." Before she left, I asked her not to tell anyone. I said I needed time before the whole family knew. She put her hand over her heart and swore on her marriage that this stayed between us until I was ready. Though she did think the family deserved to know eventually. They had been asking about grandchildren for years, and it wasn't fair to keep them in the dark forever just because I was embarrassed. That Friday, she called to say she was organizing a small dinner. Just immediate family, she said. I really needed to get out of that house. Sitting around crying wasn't going to bring the baby back. I said I didn't think I was ready for company. She sighed heavily and said this wasn't about what I wanted. Mac was struggling and he needed his family around him right now. Or was this going to be like every other time when my needs came before his? So I put on a dress and let Mac drive me to his parents' house where 30 people were waiting in the dining room. I grabbed Mac's arm and whispered that he had said immediate family. He said he guessed his mom had invited more people and told me to just get through it. Lena floated through the crowd in a cream dress, and when she saw me, she rushed over and grabbed my face with both hands and said loudly, "Oh, you poor thing. You look exhausted. Have you been sleeping at all? You have bags under your eyes?" And everyone nearby turned to look. Halfway through dinner, Lena stood up and tapped her wine glass, and the room went quiet. She said she needed everyone's prayers, that her son had just lost his first baby, and she was trying to be strong for him, but her heart was absolutely shattered. 30 faces turned toward me simultaneously. She sat back down and grabbed my hand and leaned close and whispered that I should really smile because people were going to think I didn't appreciate them being there for me. I decided in that exact moment that tomorrow morning I was sitting Mac down and making him choose. For the first time in 5 years, I was done being afraid of what would happen when I finally stopped being polite. The car ride home was silent for the first 10 minutes. Mac finally cleared his throat and said he knew tonight wasn't what I expected. I laughed out loud because that was the single greatest understatement I had ever heard. "Mac, your mother announced our miscarriage to 30 people after she promised she wouldn't tell anyone." He tightened his grip on the steering steering wheel and said she was trying to help, that she thought I needed support, turned to look at him and asked if she thought I needed support or if she thought she needed an audience. He didn't answer. We pulled into the driveway and he turned off the car and sat there staring at the garage door. Then he said quietly that he needed me to apologize to her, that I had barely spoken to anyone all night, that I hadn't thanked her for the dinner, that I had just sat there looking miserable, and now she was upset because she thought I was mad at her. I told him I was mad at her. She had told everyone about the baby after she promised she wouldn't. He sighed and rubbed his eyes and said she had made a mistake, that she had gotten emotional, but giving her the silent treatment all night had been cruel and I needed to apologize by the next morning. I got out of the car and walked inside without answering. He followed me into the bedroom and said he was serious, that she had called him crying on the way home, that she thought I hated her. I pulled on my pajamas and said good, maybe she should think about why. He stared at me like I had said something incomprehensible. He said I was being unreasonable, that all she had done was ask for prayers. That was what family did. I climbed into bed and turned off the lamp and said if he couldn't see what she had done wrong, then I didn't know how to explain it to him. He stood in the dark for a long moment, then walked out and I heard the guest room door close behind him. The next morning I woke up to 17 text messages. Mac's aunt asking if I was okay because Lena had called her worried about my mental state. His cousin asking if I needed anything because she had heard I wasn't handling the loss well. Another cousin saying Lena had mentioned I had been acting erratic and did I want to talk to someone professional. I found Mac in the kitchen drinking coffee and showed him my phone. He glanced at the screen and shrugged and said she was just worried about me, that we all were. I said she wasn't worried about me. She was trying to make everyone think I was crazy so that when I finally told them what she had done, they wouldn't believe me. Mac set down his coffee and said to listen to myself right now, that I sounded paranoid, that his mother loved me and was trying to help, and I was acting like she was some kind of villain. I stared at him and realized he was never going to see it. He had spent 30 years being trained to believe everything Lena did came from love and nothing I said was going to undo. That in a single conversation, 3 days later, a coworker stopped me in the hallway and asked if everything was okay at home. She looked uncomfortable when I asked what she meant. She said Lena had come to her church's prayer group the night before and had asked everyone to pray for me because I wasn't taking care of myself. She had said I had been struggling since the pregnancy and she was worried I might hurt myself. I felt the floor tilt beneath me for the second time in 2 weeks. Lena had gone to my coworker's church. She had stood up in front of strangers and painted me as someone who might hurt herself. She was building a case, documenting a pattern, making sure that when I finally said something out loud, people would already believe I was unstable. I drove home and found Mac watching television and told him what his mother had done. He muted the screen and said she had mentioned she was going to talk to some people about getting me support. He said he thought it was a good idea actually, that I hadn't been myself lately. He walked over and put his hands on my shoulders the way you calm a frightened animal and said he thought I should talk to someone. A therapist maybe. His mom knew a really good one from church. He said she thought I wasn't processing the loss in a healthy way, and honestly he was starting to agree with her. I pulled away and asked if he wanted me to see a therapist his mother recommended so she could control that narrative too. He threw his hands up and said, see, this was exactly what he was talking about. That acting like everyone was out to get me wasn't normal, wasn't healthy. That night he moved into the guest room. He said he needed space to think because I was refusing to apologize and refusing to get help and he didn't know what else to do. I lay in our bed alone staring at the ceiling and thought about how Lena had managed to isolate me completely in less than 2 weeks. My husband thought I was crazy. His family thought I was crazy. My coworkers thought I was crazy. She had taken my worst moment and used it to dismantle every relationship I had, and she had done it all while crying and asking for prayers. The next morning, I saw that Lena had posted a photo from the dinner on Facebook. It was a picture of her hugging me at the table with her eyes closed and her face pressed against my hair. The caption said, "Please pray for my sweet daughter-in-law during this difficult time. She is struggling, but our family will get her through it." 200 likes. 40 comments about what an amazing mother-in-law she was. A dozen people tagging mental health resources for me to read. I screenshotted everything and sent it to my best friend Danielle with the message, "Am I crazy or is this insane?" She called me immediately. She said what the actual hell was wrong with this woman and that she was posting about my miscarriage on Facebook and making it sound like I was having a breakdown. I told her everything. The dinner, the texts, the prayer group, Mac moving to the guest room. Danielle was quiet for a long moment and then said I needed to get out of there. That this woman was trying to destroy me and my husband was helping her do it. I said I couldn't just leave. She said I could stay with her, but that what Lena was doing was not normal, that it was calculated, that she was setting me up for something and I needed to figure out what it was before she finished building her case. 2 weeks after the dinner, Lena called and said she needed help setting up for her 30th anniversary party. Kenneth was out of town until Thursday and she couldn't possibly do everything herself. She said it would mean so much to her if I came to help. I said yes because Mac was standing right there and because I knew refusing would give her more ammunition. Saturday morning, I drove to her house and spent 3 hours carrying boxes and ironing tablecloths while she supervised from the couch and pointed out everything I was doing wrong. The napkins needed to be folded into swans, not rectangles. The centerpieces needed to go on the west side of the room where the light was better for photos. Around noon, she sent me upstairs to grab extra chairs from the bedroom closet. They were in the back, she said, behind the boxes. Make sure I didn't mess anything up while I was looking. The closet was enormous. A walk-in the size of my living room with shelves and drawers and racks of clothes organized by color. I pushed past the dresses and moved some boxes and found the chairs folded against the back wall. As I pulled them out, I knocked a shoebox from the top shelf and it fell open and receipts scattered everywhere. I knelt down to gather them. Jewelry receipts. A diamond bracelet from 2 years ago. Pearl earrings from last Christmas. A necklace that cost more than my car. I had never once seen Lena wear any of these things in all the years I had known her. I was putting them back when I heard her phone buzz from the nightstand in the bedroom. She must have left it upstairs when she went to answer the door earlier. I should have ignored it. it. I should have grabbed the chairs and gone back downstairs and pretended I had never seen anything. But something made me walk over and look at the screen. The notification was from someone named Emmanuel with a heart emoji. The preview showed the first line of the message. Last night was perfect. I can't stop thinking about you. My whole body went cold. Emmanuel, I knew that name. He was the deacon at Lena's church. He had been coming to family dinners for years, always sitting beside her, always refilling her wine glass before anyone else's, always laughing a little too hard at her jokes. I picked up her phone and typed in the passcode I had watched her enter 100 times at family gatherings. It opened immediately. I went to Emmanuel's thread and started scrolling. I miss you already. You're the only one who understands me. Kenneth doesn't touch me the way you do. I wish I'd married you instead. 7 years of messages. 7 years of I love you and I need you and you're my soulmate and descriptions of things that made my stomach turn. I kept scrolling and found photos. Lena in a hotel room. Emmanuel shirtless. The two of them together with timestamps from dates I recognized. Their anniversary trip to Napa. The family reunion in Lake Tahoe. Christmas Eve 2 years ago when she said she was tired and went to bed early. I backed out of the messages and checked her photos and found a hidden album with hundreds more. Hotel rooms and restaurant receipts and screenshots of reservations at places she had told Kenneth she was visiting with friends. Then I remembered the jewelry receipts. I went back to the closet and checked the dates. Every piece had been purchased within a week of one of their trips together. Emmanuel had been buying her gifts she couldn't wear around her husband. Gifts she kept hidden in the closet like trophies. I stood in that closet surrounded by 7 years of evidence and felt something shift inside me. This woman had destroyed my reputation. She had turned my husband against me. She had announced my dead baby to 30 people and then told everyone I was crazy when I got upset about it. And the entire time she had been preaching about faithfulness and family values while sleeping with the church deacon. I pulled out my phone and started screenshotting everything. Texts, photos, receipts. I worked quickly and methodically and saved every piece of evidence to my own phone. Then I put her phone back exactly where I found it, grabbed the chairs, and walked downstairs. Lena looked up from the couch and smiled and said she had found them and thank you so much for helping. She said she really did appreciate me and that she knew things had been hard between us lately. I smiled back and said of course. That was what family was for. She had no idea what I had just found. That night I showed Mac everything. I sat him down at the kitchen table and told him I needed him to actually look at what I was about to show him before he said anything. He sighed like I was about to waste his time. Then I slid my phone across the table with Emmanuel's messages open on the screen. He scrolled in silence for a long time. I watched his face and waited for the moment when he realized I had been telling the truth about her all along. When he finally looked up, his expression was disgust, aimed at me. You went through my mother's phone, he said. I told him to look at what was on there. 7 years of an affair with the church deacon. Photos, receipts, all of it. He stood up and threw my phone on the table and said he didn't care what was on there. That I had broken into his mother's phone and invaded her privacy and was now trying to use whatever I found to turn him against her. I said I hadn't broken into anything. That she had left her phone upstairs and I had seen the notification. He said I was obsessed with proving she was evil. That I had been going through her phone looking for dirt. That I could hear how crazy that sounded, couldn't I? I grabbed the phone and held it up and told him to look at the photos, the dates. She had been with Emmanuel on their anniversary trip, on Christmas Eve. This wasn't paranoia. This was proof. He shook his head slowly and said, or it was fake. That I could have made all of this up. Photoshopped the texts and created fake screenshots to frame her because I was jealous of how close they were. I stared at him and understood finally and completely that he was never going to believe me. It didn't matter what evidence I had. He had spent 30 years believing everything, his mother said, and nothing, not even proof of her affair, was going to change that. He walked toward the door and stopped and said he was going to stay at his mom's tonight. That he thought I needed some time alone to think about what I had done. He left and I sat at the kitchen table looking at the screenshots on my phone and trying to understand how Lena had managed to win even when I had evidence of her worst secret. The next morning I woke up to a text from an unknown number. I know what you found. Keep your mouth shut or I'll tell everyone you caused your own miscarriage. I stared at the message and read it 3 more times while my hands started to shake. She knew. Somehow she already knew. And instead of being scared, she was threatening me. I drove to her house and found them on the porch drinking coffee. Lena smiled and said, "Good morning, sweetheart," and asked if I had slept okay. Max said I had been having trouble sleeping lately, held up my phone and showed her the text. She tilted her head with practiced confusion and said she didn't know what I was talking about. Mac took the phone and read the message and said I had probably sent it to myself to make her look bad just like I had faked the screenshots. Lena reached over and patted his arm and said it was okay, that I wasn't well, that maybe it was time to talk about getting me some real help before I did something I couldn't take back. I looked between them, mother and son, completely united against me, and understood that private confrontation was never going to work. She had spent 30 years training him to believe her over everyone else. She had contingencies and excuses and tears ready for every accusation I could throw at her. If I wanted to expose her, I was going to have to do it somewhere she couldn't spin the story. Somewhere with witnesses. Somewhere the evidence could speak for itself. The anniversary party was 6 days away. 200 guests. A projector screen. A microphone. If she wanted to celebrate 30 years of faithful marriage, I was going to make sure everyone saw exactly what those 30 years really looked like. I wore the red dress Lena had once told me was too attention-seeking for someone with my complexion. I did my makeup slowly and carefully and thought about what I was about to do. The USB drive was already in my purse. I had spent 5 days organizing everything. Text by date, photos arranged chronologically, a complete timeline of 7 years of lies mapped against every family event and holiday and anniversary trip she had used as cover. The venue was a ballroom at the nicest hotel in town. Crystal chandeliers and white tablecloths, and 200 guests in their best clothes waiting to celebrate what they believed was a faithful 30-year marriage. Lena spotted me the moment I walked in and rushed over with her arms outstretched. She pulled me into a hug and whispered whispered in my ear to smile, or everyone would think I was having another episode. I smiled and said I wouldn't miss this for the world. That tonight was going to be unforgettable. She pulled back and looked at me with something almost like suspicion. Then someone called her name and she floated away. The program started at 7. A slideshow of 30 years of photographs, toasts from family and friends, a speech from Lena about the secret to a lasting marriage. Emmanuel stood up to give a toast. He was tall and handsome with gray at his temples and the kind of confidence that came from years of being trusted. He said he had known Lena and Kenneth for almost 15 years and could honestly say he had never met a more devoted couple, that their marriage was an inspiration, that the way they supported each other and put their family first was something younger couples should aspire to. He raised his glass to 30 more years. Everyone drank. I watched Lena dab at her eyes with a napkin while Emmanuel took his seat beside his wife, the wife who had no idea. Then Lena walked to the microphone. 30 years, she began. Her voice trembled with practiced emotion. 30 years ago, I married my best friend, and every single day since then, I have woken up grateful that I get to spend my life with him. We have had our challenges, every marriage does, but we have never stopped choosing each other. We have never broken the vows we made to each other in front of God and our families. I stood up. My chair scraped against the floor, and several people turned to look at me. I climbed the steps to the stage and asked if I could add something. Lena's smile flickered. She stepped back from the microphone and gestured for me to go ahead. I walked to the tech booth first and handed the young man running the projector the USB drive. I told him to add it to the slideshow and play it when I gave him the signal. He looked confused, but he plugged it in. Then I walked back to the microphone and looked out at 200 faces. I found Kenneth at the head table. I found Mac frozen in his seat near the back. I found Emmanuel already beginning to straighten in his chair as though some instinct was telling him something was wrong. I thanked everyone for being there. I talked about what it meant to celebrate 30 years of a marriage built on faithfulness and trust and commitment. I said that Lena had spent the last several weeks reminding everyone around her what those values meant. Then I nodded at the tech booth. The screen behind me changed. Last night was perfect. I can't stop thinking about you. A photograph of Lena and Emmanuel in a hotel room with a timestamp from 5 years. I wish I'd married you instead of Kenneth. The room went completely silent. Lena's hand closed around my wrist. Her grip was tight enough to leave marks, and her smile never moved. She leaned close and said through her teeth that if I did anything else right now, she would destroy me. That she would tell everyone I was having a breakdown. That she would make sure Shane never spoke to me again. I pulled my arm away and said quietly that she had already done all of that. What else did she have? Her smile cracked. Just for a second. Then she composed herself and said loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear that of course I could say a few words. That we were all family here. She grabbed my elbow and steered me toward the hallway with that iron grip disguised as affection and pushed me into a coat closet and closed the door behind us. In the darkness, I could finally see her real face. No smile, no warmth, just cold calculation. She said she knew I had found something. That Mac had told her I had gone through her phone. She said whatever I thought I had, it wouldn't work. That she had spent 30 years building relationships in this community. 30 years being the woman everyone trusted. And I had spent 2 weeks acting like a crazy person who couldn't handle losing a baby. I felt my whole body go rigid. I didn't lose a baby. I said quietly, my baby died. There is a difference. She waved her hand and said the point was that no one was going to believe me over her. That I could have video evidence and they would still think I had faked it because she had already told them how unstable I was, how paranoid, how obsessed with destroying her. She stepped closer and told me here was what was going to happen. I was going to go back out there and smile and clap and act like a supportive daughter-in-law. And then I was going to go home and pack my things and file for divorce and disappear from her son's life forever. If I did that quietly, she wouldn't tell anyone what really happened with my miscarriage. My blood went cold. She smiled, and it was the cruelest expression I had ever seen on a human face. She said she meant that stress caused miscarriages. Everyone knew that. And I had been so stressed, hadn't I? Working all those hours, fighting with Mac about having children when he wasn't ready, pushing and pushing until my body gave out. That was the story she would tell if I made her. That I had wanted a baby so badly I ignored the warning signs. That I had kept working instead of resting. That I had caused my own loss because I was too selfish to slow down. I stared at her in the darkness of that coat closet and realized I was looking at someone with no limits whatsoever. Someone who would say anything and destroy anyone to protect herself. I said I had actually thought she might love Mac. That everything she did was misguided maternal instinct. But she didn't love anyone, did she? Not Kenneth, not Mac, not even Emmanuel. She just loved being worshipped. Something moved in her eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or recognition. I said I found the jewelry. The bracelet and the pearls and the necklace. All those gifts from Emmanuel she kept hidden in her closet like trophies because she couldn't wear them around her husband. Proof that someone wanted her. Her face went pale in the dim light. I said that was what this had always been about, wasn't it? Not love, not family. I just making sure everyone saw her as perfect. As the center of everything. Her hand shot out and grabbed my throat. Not hard enough to choke me. Hard enough to make her point. She said I didn't know anything about her life or what it was like to give everything to a family that took her for granted. I pulled her hand away and said she was right. I didn't know what that was like because I would never do what she had done just to feel seen. I pushed past her and opened the door and walked back into the ballroom. The photos were still on the screen. 200 people were sitting in stunned silence reading 7 years of messages between Lena and the church deacon who had just given a toast about what an inspiration their marriage was. Kenneth was standing at the head table. He walked toward the screen slowly and read the messages one by one with a completely blank expression. When he got to the one from their 25th anniversary that said she wished she was with Emmanuel that night instead of him, he reached up and removed his wedding ring. He looked at Lena for a long moment. Then he threw the ring at her face and walked out the front door without a single word. Half the room followed him. Lena screamed that the photos were fake and I was lying and I was jealous and mentally unstable and trying to destroy her family. But the images kept scrolling behind her and every word she said made it worse. Emmanuel's wife stood up and threw her champagne glass at the wall, and it shattered. The pastor who had called Lena an example of Christian womanhood stood frozen with his mouth open. Two of Mac's cousins had pinned Emmanuel against the wall and were asking him how long he had been sleeping with their aunt. Mac stood up slowly. The room went quieter. Every eye turned to him. He looked at his mother. He looked at the screen where a photo of her and Emmanuel in a hotel room was currently displayed. He looked at me standing beside the microphone. "Is it true?" he asked his mother. His voice was quiet, but in the silent room everyone could hear it. "Have you been cheating on Dad for 7 years?" Lena's face crumpled. She said yes, but he had to understand. That Kenneth hadn't touched her in years. That Emmanuel understood her. That she still loved Kenneth. She just needed someone who appreciated her. Mac turned and walked out of the room without letting her finish. Lena ran after him. Her heel caught the edge of the stage and she grabbed the anniversary cake display to steady herself. It wasn't stable enough to hold her weight. The whole thing tipped forward and she went down face first into 3 tiers of white frosting and fondant. For a moment, nobody moved. Then someone in the back started laughing. It spread through the room like water finding its level until half the guests were laughing and the other half were filming on their phones. Lena pushed herself up onto her knees, frosting dripping from her hair, designer dress destroyed, mascara running in black rivers down her cheeks. She looked around the room at 200 people who had spent years telling her how perfect she was and found nothing but disgust and pity and barely contained laughter. "Stop filming," she screamed. "Stop it right now. This is a private family matter." I said into the microphone that she had lost the right to privacy when she made my miscarriage public. Now everyone could see who she really was. I stepped down from the stage and walked toward the exit. Emmanuel's wife caught my arm as I passed and said thank you. That she had suspected for years, but never had proof. Mac was waiting near the door. His face was pale and his eyes were red and he looked like someone who had just watched everything he believed collapse in real time. He asked how I could humiliate her like that in front of everyone. Said she had announced my miscarriage to 30 people after promising to keep it secret. She had told everyone I was crazy. She had threatened to tell people I caused my own baby's death. And every single time he had chosen her. He shook his head slowly. I reached into my purse and pulled out the burner phone I had taken from Lena's closet when I found the messages. I pressed it into his hands and told him it had everything. Every message, every photo, every lie she had told his father for 7 years. I had been going to show him privately. I had wanted to give him the chance to handle it as a family. But he had called me crazy. He had moved out and stayed with her and let her threaten me. So I handled it the only way she had left me. I stepped around him and pushed open the door and walked out into the cool night air. Behind me, I could still hear Lena screaming my name, sobbing somewhere in the wreckage of her own anniversary party, covered in cake frosting, asking someone to help her up. I didn't look back. I sat in my car for a long time without starting the engine. I had just destroyed my mother-in-law's marriage and reputation in front of 200 people. I had just ended my own marriage in the most public way possible. I had burned every bridge I had to the family I had spent 5 years trying to belong to. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel bad. I felt free. For the first time since the night Lena had stood up at that dinner and announced my dead baby to a room full of people while asking them to pray for her shattered heart. My phone buzzed. Danielle, she had seen something on Facebook and wanted to know if I was okay and what I had done. I typed back that I would tell her everything and asked if I could stay at her place tonight. She responded immediately, already making up the guest room. "Get here safe." I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot without looking. Back at the hotel where my mother-in-law was still covered in frosting and screaming about how I had ruined her life. She had ruined mine. First, I just returned the favor. Subscribe. Because some women spend years being polite and one night being absolutely done with it. New stories every week. Hit that button.